removing his name. A longtime aide is distancing Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI from a book on priestly celibacy. On the move, new developments in the timeline for the articles of impeachment to be transferred from the House to the Senate. We have a report and reaction. Mandatory evacuations. A natural disaster is affecting thousands of people in the Philippines. And taking charge. Pope Francis tells the faithful what traits God loves from those in authority. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, January 14th, 2020. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. An update to a story that we first brought you last night. The private secretary of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI says the former pontiff was not informed that he would be presented as a co-author of a new book on priestly celibacy. He says Benedict has asked for his name and his photo to be removed from the cover of the book, From the Depths of Our Hearts. According to a German-language news agency, Archbishop Georg Gainswein says that Benedict wrote the text on priestly celibacy included in the book and freely gave it to Cardinal Robert Sarah at his request. He goes on to say the Pope Emeritus knew that it would appear in a book, but adds there had been a, quote, misunderstanding with Cardinal Sarah and that Benedict never intended to have his name on the book. Joining me now to help unravel all of this is Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency and a canon lawyer. Ed, welcome back. Thanks so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Well, Benedict's secretary says this was a, quote, misunderstanding without putting into doubt the good faith of Cardinal Sarah. What do we know about communications between Cardinal Sarah and the Pope Emeritus as this book was being put together?
Well, Cardinal Sarah's released a number of letters from the Pope Emeritus to him, basically along the stages of editing his own contribution, showing that, he'd made available this material he'd written on priestly celibacy to the Cardinal, that he knew it was going to be included in a book on that subject, even going so far as to, approving the edits that Cardinal Sarah had made and suggesting his own. So there was that level of cooperation and collaboration, that much seems clear. Cardinal Sarah has also said that the Pope Emeritus saw an entire draft of the book. So there does seem to still be a bit of a confused narrative around this.
Yeah, a lot of questions. Cardinal Sarah tweeted a statement which reads, in part, it has been decided that the author of the book will be for future publications, Cardinal Sarah, with a contribution of Benedict XVI. However, the full text remains absolutely unchanged. Do you think that's going to be enough to settle this controversy?
I don't think so, but that's because I think to a great extent this controversy exists because people want there to be a controversy about it. In a sense, what happened was a book was written. It was written by two people. They made the contributions they made. Their names were on the specific contributions. I mean, there was never any doubt which chapters were Cardinal Sarah's, which one was from the Pope Emeritus. Nothing in the contents of the book has changed. In a sense, whether the Pope Emeritus is listed as a co-author or a contributor has no real bearing on the contents of the book and who said what within it. So if the controversy isn't related to the book itself, but who's on the cover, changing what's on the cover is probably just going to spin this out a bit more.
Yeah, well, meanwhile, we have a statement from the book's English language publisher, Ignatius Press, which reads, quote, given that according to Benedict XVI's correspondence and Cardinal Sarah's statement, the two men collaborated on this book for several months, that none of the essays have appeared elsewhere, and that a joint work, as defined by the Chicago Manual of Style, is a work prepared by two or more authors with the intention that their contribution be merged into inseparable or interdependent parts of a unitary whole. Ignatius Press considers this a co-authored publication. So with that in mind, what happens next, do you think?
Well, it's interesting. It's quite something for the publishers of a book, or at least the English language translation of a book, to say, we're keeping it as it is, even though apparently both authors would prefer it be presented in a different way. But I think what it does is it points very directly to the fact that there's really very little of substance within this controversy other than whose name goes on the cover where and whose picture's on it. That the publishers have said, as far as we're concerned, as far as the Chicago Manual of Style is concerned, this is a co-authored book, and we're presenting it that way. Now, Cardinal Sarah and the Pope Emeritus might want it presented a little differently now in the light of all of the controversy we've seen in the last 24 hours. But again, it doesn't change the substance of who wrote what in the book.
Yeah, Ed, thank you so much for your insight on this. We really appreciate it. Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency. Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
While the House prepares to vote tomorrow to send the articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump to the Senate, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the historic trial will begin next Tuesday. It is just the third presidential impeachment trial in American history. Catholic News Agency's Matt Hadro reports now from Capitol Hill.
Tracy, Democrats have been pushing Senate Republicans to consider new testimony, arguing that fresh information has emerged during Speaker Pelosi's month-long delay in sending over the articles of impeachment. But now, the wait appears to be over, and the end is in sight. Speaker Pelosi makes it official. Writing in a statement, the House will now proceed with a vote on transmitting the articles of impeachment and naming impeachment managers on Wednesday, January 15th. House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler says some of the House managers will come from his committee.
We'll contribute.
Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester tells us she's praying for a fair Senate trial.
They will allow for witnesses, they will look at the evidence, and they will be fair. That's what the American people want, that's what we expect, and that's what we need.
The chairman of the Democratic caucus echoes that call.
The next step is simple. The Senate should conduct a fair trial. A fair trial involves witnesses and documents.
Included on his list of witnesses, close advisors to the president, who are privy to the details of his July 25th phone call with the Ukrainian president.
We should hear from Mick Mulvaney about that call and the actions that preceded it and followed. We should hear from John Bolton about that July 25th phone call.
But the Senate Majority Leader laughs off that idea.
The latest Democratic talking point is that if the Senate conducts a trial based on what the House itself looked at, we'll be engaged in a cover-up. Did you get that? Unless the Senate steps outside our lane and takes it upon ourselves to supplement the House case, it's a cover-up.
Several Republican senators, including Mitt Romney of Utah, have said they are open to voting to call trial witnesses. At the Capitol, Matt Hadro, EWTN News Nightly.
President Trump is also preparing for the next phase of impeachment proceedings in the Senate. His White House and personal attorneys will both take part. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Mark?
Tracy, White House officials say the president is not likely to delay his State of the Union address due to his impeachment trial, but it's still not clear how the process will play out.
President Trump received loud cheers last night at the National College Football Championship game in Louisiana, while in Washington, support for the president is divided over his impeachment. As Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi has called for fairness in a Senate trial, the president is critical of the Democratic-led impeachment effort in the House, tweeting, "It was the most unfair witch hunt in the history of Congress." And over the weekend, the president suggested the Senate should dismiss the charges altogether without holding a trial, saying, "Many believe that by the Senate giving credence to a trial based on the no evidence, no crime, read the transcripts, no pressure impeachment hoax, rather than an outright dismissal, it gives the partisan Democrat witch hunt credibility that it otherwise does not have. I agree." Earlier, the president argued for a trial, believing it could clear his name of wrongdoing. The idea of quickly dismissing the impeachment charges has gained support from some Republican senators, including Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. But it has become clear there aren't enough votes for the GOP majority to use that strategy. The president's opinion about impeachment hasn't changed.
Because it's the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the United States government. This isn't just the Ukraine hoax. This is the witch hunt. This is the whole thing with Russia that turned out to be a total fabricated plot.
We're likely to hear more from the president on impeachment tonight during a rally in Milwaukee. Tomorrow, the president and China's vice premier are scheduled to sign a phase one agreement toward a potential larger trade deal between the U.S. and China, a step toward potentially ending this ongoing trade war between the two countries. Tracy.
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thanks, Mark. Well, Iran says that it has made arrests in the accidental shooting down of a Ukrainian passenger plane. The crash earlier this month killed all 176 people on board. It also sparked protests in Tehran, with demonstrators calling for accountability. Officials have not confirmed how many arrests were made. Iran admits it shot down the plane, but says it was a mistake. Joining us now from Capitol Hill is Congressman Michael Waltz, Republican from Florida and member of the House Armed Services Committee. Representative Waltz, welcome back and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So how relevant is it that the Iranian government has publicly said that it was responsible for the downing of that airplane?
Well, I'm glad they finally admitted to this heinous and horrific act. It was incredibly disturbing that the Iranian government initially covered it up. And I think that's what you're seeing the Iranian people protest now so courageously and so forcefully, that this is one of just another long string of lies from this dictatorship, this religious dictatorship that is the Iranian regime.
Yeah, speaking of the protests, the footage from the protest over the weekend was pretty dramatic. And I know that you reference it on social media. What, if anything, do you think the U.S. should do to help the demonstrators?
Well, I think one thing that is so clear and different now is that these protesters, these people just desperately crying out for their own freedoms, and are also protesting the endemic corruption that's found in the regime, believe they have the support and do have the support of the President of the United States. And that's such a contrast to 2009, when the Green movement in Iran really took off and really gained grassroots, massive popular support. And what did they hear from Washington? Silence. That really, I think, in many ways took the wind out of their sail. Now this president has said, we support you, we're with you. He said it repeatedly, publicly, and in Farsi, and has shown his willingness to act and stand up to the regime.
Congressman, what do you think the chances are the protests will lead to a regime change?
Well, I don't know yet, and I don't know how this is really going to unfold, except that I know that Iran is full of Kurds, is full of Arabs, is full of folks called the Baluch and others that have been pushing back against the oppressiveness of this regime for decades now. To see it take off in Tehran is promising. At the end of the day, what we want from the U.S. perspective is the regime to change its behavior, to stop supporting terrorism, stop taking Americans and others hostage. There are Americans right now literally chained to the floor of Iranian prisons for no other crime except being Americans, and stop its development of ballistic missiles and a nuclear weapons program. We're not looking to suspend it. We want to stop it and eliminate it. That's what we're looking for from a U.S. policy perspective, for stability across the Middle East. But for the Iranian people, they're looking to have a free and open future, and that's something the United States absolutely should support. In fact, if I could just say, the Republicans in the House just tried to enter a bill onto the floor of the House of Representatives, publicly supporting these protesters as well, and unfortunately it was blocked by the Democrats from coming to the floor, and that to me is incredibly disappointing.
Yeah. Well, Representative Michael Waltz, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your insight. Michael Waltz, Republican from the state of Florida, thanks for joining us, and thank you for your service.
Thanks so much.
Coming up, the health hazard affecting tens of thousands of people in the Philippines. And an update on the efforts to bring peace to South Sudan. A volcano near the capital of the Philippines is spewing lava a half a mile high. The tall volcano trembled constantly today, and officials are concerned a bigger and more dangerous eruption could come at any time. There is a mandatory evacuation for people living near the tremors. Tens of thousands of others are being moved as well over health concerns that they could be inhaling too much smoke and ash. In Puerto Rico, a mass was held in a makeshift structure over the weekend after a magnitude 5.9 earthquake damaged the Church of the Immaculate Conception in Guanaca. The earthquake caused millions of dollars in damages along the island's southern coast. There have been no reports of injuries or deaths. For some Orthodox Christians, today is the start of a new year. Members of the Greek Orthodox community in Gaza gathered at a church service to mark the occasion. Pieces of holy bread were handed to worshipers. Around 1,000 Christians live in the region. The majority are Orthodox, some are Catholic. Britain's Prime Minister says that he is confident the royal family can resolve the crisis over the future plans of Prince Harry and his wife Meghan. Boris Johnson also says the situation will be easier if politicians do not provide a running commentary. Queen Elizabeth II has said that she and senior royals respect the couple's decision, but would have preferred they remain full-time royals. Prince Harry and his wife want to spend substantial amounts of time in Canada. A major step towards peace in South Sudan.
And if we end up fighting one another, why did we fight for our country? And that is the principle. So we have genuinely agreed. I believe, as we have been talking to our brothers on the other side, let us have peace. Let us recommit ourselves to peace.
The South Sudan government and the Opposition Movements Alliance have vowed to recommit to a truce agreement. Both sides called Pope Francis's act of kissing the feet of the South Sudan leaders last April a great example of reconciliation and peace. The promise comes after a meeting with the community of Sant'Egidio. Paolo Impagliazzo is the Secretary General of the community of Sant'Egidio. He joins us now from Rome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
What is the declaration and how did it come about?
The declaration, the Rome Declaration, as the party decided to call it, it is a very important one because for the first time since the discussion of the peace agreement in Addis Ababa, all the parties involved in the South Sudan conflict were present, especially the SOMA, that is the South Sudan Opposition Movement Alliance, together with the government of South Sudan. And I think it's a very important declaration because the most important achievement they reached is to adhere to the cessation of hostilities signed in December 2017 to avoid any further confrontation, armed confrontation between the signatory and non-signatory, and to create a conducive environment for a political discussion on the root causes of the conflict. And we can also add that they reaffirm their will and their readiness to allow humanitarian organizations to reach across the country the civil population affected by the war and by the natural disasters.
How has Sant'Egidio intervened between the two sides?
Was a long process. We started as soon as Pope Francis called for the spiritual retreat in the Vatican, and after his incredible gesture, kneeling and kissing the feet of the leader of South Sudan, we decided to help Pope Francis and the Church to be very important, bringing them to peace, to the peace. That's why we had a lot of bilateral meetings with all the protagonists, with the government, with the SOMA, with this alliance that are non-signatories to the agreement, and with all the other opposition parties that signed the agreement, but they are not able until now to form the transitional government together with the government.
Pope Francis has expressed his desire to visit South Sudan this year, but there are security concerns. What needs to change in order to pave the way for a papal visit?
I think that the most important things are not the security issues, but the political achievement. I think that Pope Francis has expressed his will to go to visit South Sudan, but I think that we need political development, the formation of an inclusive government, so that he can go and visit all the people of South Sudan.
So this is just one step towards peace. What happens after this?
So in the declaration, we have already agreed to discuss the mechanism to permit to this SOMA group, to this non-signatories group, to be part of the monitoring and evaluating mechanism of the ceasefire. So the first step will be in 2 weeks to convene another meeting between the non-signatories, the government, and the IGAD, that is a regional body involved in the peace process, so that they can find a political solution to find a way in which these non-signatories could be part of this mechanism of monitoring and evaluation of the ceasefire.
Paolo Impagliazzo, Secretary General of the Community of Sant'Egidio, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me again.
Up next, a preview of tonight's Democratic presidential debate. And Pope Francis has advice for those in authority. A much smaller field of presidential hopefuls face off tonight for the final Democratic debate before the Iowa caucuses. Just 6 candidates are gathering in Des Moines. That is the smallest number yet on a debate stage. Taking the stage tonight, former Vice President Joe Biden, Senators Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Amy Klobuchar, former Mayor Pete Buttigieg, and businessman Tom Steyer. And joining me now with a preview is Matthew Continetti, founding editor, that is, of the Washington Free Beacon. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about the significance of tonight's debate. What do the candidates need to do?
Well, I think they need to attack each other. We've had a variety of debates up to this point. This may be the most important debate yet, with only 3 weeks to go before the Iowa caucuses. I think Joe Biden needs to reassure Democratic voters once again that he remains their best bet to defeat Donald Trump in November. And then I think you're going to see Bernie Sanders take the fight to both Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren in order to break out of the pack in Iowa.
Yeah. Going into the debate tonight, a lot of attention has been focused on that private conversation between Senators Sanders and Elizabeth Warren 2 years ago, in which Sanders allegedly said that a female candidate couldn't win against President Donald Trump. Do you think we're going to see them go after each other tonight, or do you think the focus is going to be on Joe Biden?
It's hard to say. One thing, when in doubt, the Democrats will go to identity politics. So that's what you see with Elizabeth Warren. I thought it was interesting. She's not picking any policy fights with Bernie Sanders. She's not saying that his socialist policies are too radical for the country or will lead to his defeat in November. Instead, she's saying, he picked on me because I'm a woman. With Biden, I think there will be policy contrasts. With Warren, it will be identity politics.
Turning to Capitol Hill now, the House is expected to vote tomorrow on a resolution appointing House impeachment managers and then transmitting the articles of impeachment to the Senate. It's still unclear if we're going to hear new witnesses' testimony as part of this trial. How important do you think this is, if at all?
Well, I think witnesses would be a major development in the story of Donald Trump's impeachment trial. I don't know if it's going to happen or not, because you have to remember witnesses are a double-edged sword here. The Democrats want to hear from figures like Joe Biden, but the Republicans want to hear from someone like Hunter Biden. And so the question is, do Democrats really want to take that risk, right? And I'm not sure we're going to see that in the end. But that will be a vote that will take place after the initial arguments are made.
All right. Any final thoughts when it comes to the impeachment?
Only that the very urgent impeachment that needed to be conducted within the space of 6 weeks has now been on ice for a month, and I think it shows how unserious Nancy Pelosi has been throughout this whole process, and I think that hands McConnell an advantage as the action moves to the Senate.
All right. Thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Matthew Continetti, founding editor, that is, of the Washington Free Beacon. Thank you again. And finally tonight, Pope Francis has a message for people in charge.
I pastori incoerenti, schizofrenici che non danno testimonianza.
At his daily mass at the Vatican, the Holy Father says true authority does not come from commanding that others follow orders. Instead, it comes from being consistent and from having a strong inner faith, because that leads to outward confidence and can inspire those around you. We thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.